Hey everyone, thank you so much for showing an interest in the work that I do. I have so many people ask me, how do you do this incredible crystallography? Do you need a microscope? Do you need all this crazy equipment? And the simple answer is no. I do all of my work in my kitchen here. I use glass petri dishes. I do not use a microscope. I use my phone's camera. And this is pretty much all you need, as well as some paper towels. So I am going to start telling you about petri dishes. So I like glass petri dishes as opposed to plastic for a number of reasons. Essentially, glass is made of silica. Silica is a type of crystal, and crystals store vast amounts of information. And this helps the water to store information for longer. Now, glass petri dishes come with a lid. And people will often ask me, do you cover the dishes when it's in the freezer? And the answer is no, I don't like to, for a couple of reasons. So one is very practical. The dish at the top will start to kind of frost over, and then you can't see inside with your main sample to see what it's doing in there. So that's a problem. The other reason is that I get slightly claustrophobic, and so I kind of have this idea that water might not like being covered over, but that's me projecting my own stuff. But I've also found that it's just so much more practical to actually not cover the dishes. So what is the deal with plastic petri dishes? Well, one of the bigger problems I have found is that when you pour the water in, the water kind of opens up in a type of hole. So it's very difficult to completely cover the plastic dish of water with water. So you can have some of that kind of problem in glass dishes, because occasionally you'll get them where there's a bit of a bump in the middle and you can feel them. So this one I can feel there's a bit of a ridge on the edge, but not in the center. And the center is the main problem if you have this kind of a lump, and that will then, the water will open around it. But if that does happen to you, you're still going to get pretty interesting crystallography. You're still going to notice some shapes and forms, and water does something very cool sometimes. So when it does open up, if it's kind of forced to based on the petri dishes, you will find sometimes it opens up into like the shape of a heart, or maybe a flower or an eye or something like that. So it will try and communicate with you in all the best possible ways. So people will often ask me, do I need a dedicated freezer or like a totally empty shelf in there for this? Well, I have children and stuff, and so my freezers are not empty. I have had the privilege years ago of having empty freezers and doing this work solely in that freezer, and that was really great. But real life is real life, and that's not always practical. So I can reassure you that whatever is in your freezer is not going to influence the water, because anything that is frozen is essentially in a state of suspension. So don't worry about that. Now, people do get very concerned about other things influencing the water, because one thing I guess we've recognized is that water in its liquid state is very much in a kind of chaotic state. It's updating its information every trillionth of a second. And so what we're doing is we're wanting to capture the first freeze. Now, what's the first freeze? So as water begins to freeze, you will see that it will start to have, there will be a liquid on top, and there'll be ice on the bottom, and that's what I call the first freeze. Now, if that water was left longer, and there would be a second layer that would freeze, and water creates this kind of scaffolding between the two, and there would be liquid water in between. And that's actually a really interesting thing to see. So if you were to put too much water in your petri dish, for example, I'll show you what too much looks like. I haven't even shown you what the right amount is yet, but I will in a minute. So filling your petri dish up halfway is way too much water. But if you do that and you freeze it for around 15 to 18 minutes, what you will find is that there will be a liquid water in between two layers of ice. And when you tip it, that liquid water will drain away and you'll see what those two layers look like. And that can be really fun because you can actually crack the top layer with your finger and you see how thin the ice slices are, and you can also see what's going on in there. Now, that secondary information, that is the water that froze on the top, that's the kind of liquid water that is on top of the first freeze. So I'm going to show you how much water we do want. I'm going to tip my camera down here. I have I'll just move all of these dishes over here for now. Okay. Now this is just a small dish, just so you can see. Sometimes that can be kind of fun to use, but I wouldn't recommend anything smaller than this. This is a 9 centimeter diameter Petri dish. You can see it's just a little bit bigger than my hand. This is my ideal size. You can get bigger, but I wouldn't get any smaller than this. It's approximately a 6 centimeter diameter Petri dish. So we have some water here in this little flask cup that I was given. So 1 tablespoon, 2 tablespoons of water, and that is all we need. Now, that is assuming that you have the same size dish as me. Now, if you have a small one, for example, like this is probably only going to need about 1 of these. And you can shake it. And now what's good about this, and hopefully you can see it perhaps, is that, I don't know if you can see here, there is it's starting to open up. It's starting to all open up and move. So it's, how can I make it so you can see it? Hopefully you can. It's opened all the way up here. So this dish has a bit of a bump in the middle. So what we're going to have to do is add a little bit more water to it to try and get that to cover and shake it over like this. So where there's a will, there is a way. So this is the right amount of water that you want. So as I hold it up, you might notice that here is the very base of the dish, and only a couple of millimeters above it is the water. So when you tip it, there should be a large space behind it and it's not all falling out. Now I will, with the larger amount of water when you tip it, it would all fall out. So this is a really good indicator of how much is the right amount. So it should just cover the dish at the bottom. So I'll just tip myself up here. Okay, so the next step is that you are going to want to inspire the water. Now, in the very, very early stages of this work, I always recommend that people don't launch into expecting water to design your face or anything around it or any of these things. Like, that expectation is not an ideal way to start this work. The best way to start this work is just to stay curious. Invite water to share its journey with you. And by that, I'm talking about start to observe its signature patterns. So what is a signature pattern? Well, each type of water has a signature pattern. For example, municipal tap water tends to form disordered lines and sort of more jagged kind of designs. It doesn't create hexagonal patterns, for example, like spring water would. And the patterns of rainwater, they tend to kind of look like a slightly curved fan. There is a lot of different patterns that I've identified, but you will identify the common patterns in your water if you keep using it. Now, the advantage of knowing what the natural patterns of your water are is that when it does something different, it's going to be obvious. Now, it's still amazing to me after looking at signature patterns for so long that water can kind of go out of its original blueprint, I suppose, of these common patterns and design something extraordinary. So water can communicate in two ways. I always say that art is the heart of water, but water can also communicate in something that I call hydroglyphs. Now, that's been something I've studied for the last 4 years. And essentially, a hydroglyph is a repeated symbol in ice that I've identified and that relates to a word. So water doesn't read words, it reads the energy of words, which is why it's not limited to different languages or symbols. So to say I have one hydroglyph, I have to have seen the same image appear at least 50 times using the same word. So that is a whole another thing, but it's important to learn about hydroglyphs, I believe, when doing this work, because water may be communicating to you in this very advanced kind of symbolic conceptual language, as opposed to designing art. So I think if you are really wanting to dive into this work, I really recommend getting the PDF of all the different hydroglyphs that I've identified so far and learning more about them. Okay, so that was a very long-winded way of talking about getting started with this freezing technique. Now, when we put it in the freezer, my freezer setting is, I think it's around about -18. So my ideal setting is -23. But the time frame for the freezing tends to be fairly standard for most regular freezers that aren't too old, which is around 5 minutes and 20 seconds. Now that's how long I'm going to put my timer on for when I put this sample in there. Now, when you do it, and because everybody's freezer is different, what are we looking for? We are looking for liquid on top and ice underneath. Now, how do we see that? Well, you can usually see that with your naked eye, but a handy tip is if you do have a torch like this on your phone, without touching the sample, you can shine it in, and when it's in the freezer, and you will have a much clearer view of what's going on in there. Now, if you look in there and you see it's still totally liquid, don't touch it, shut your freezer and put the timer on for 2 more minutes, and keep doing that until you see that there is liquid on top and ice underneath. Now, I'm going to keep talking whilst this sample is freezing, because I do want to talk about what's going on in there. So I'm going to pop this in the freezer and I'm going to put my timer on, and I'm going to talk about what we're going to do next once we pull it out of the freezer. Okay. Right, so that's in there. Now I'm going to do exactly what you are going to do and put my timer on for 5 minutes and 20 seconds as it's going down. So while we're waiting, I want to talk about what we're going to do once we pull it out. Now, it's really important to not forget this one step. In our enthusiasm, it's very easy to miss this. When we pull the dish out, what we're going to do is, firstly, we're going to tip the liquid water out. Now, what's really good thing to do is to tip it into another Petri dish. I'll just tip that one out. So you pour that excess water into another Petri dish, and you can actually freeze that sample, because that is the secondary layer of information. So what we're then going to do is wipe the bottom with a handy towel. We call them handy towels, but I think you call them paper towels in the States, if that's where you're from. And that is a really important step. It's going to make sure that you can see the crystallography really clearly, really well, that there's no frost on the bottom. Now, when you photograph your ice, what you're going to do is, I just have a regular iPhone. There's nothing special particularly about it. It has a ×1 setting and a 2.5 setting. So I always like to take one backed out photo of the crystallography, and then you push the slightly zoomed in one, and you take photos of things that you find interesting in there. So here's what we don't want to forget to do. What we don't want to forget to do is to take the photos. That seems crazy that I should have to remind you of that, but sometimes it can be so incredibly interesting that we can go forget to take the photos. And so the water, or the ice, sorry, it melts really fast. And you have a very small window of opportunity of taking the photos. So take the photos first and then go through them later. And you'll see that your camera can pick up so much more information than our eyes can, because you can zoom in and see what's in there. And that's my favorite part. So I think that that is definitely something that a lot of people can get caught out on, but even I do. I get like caught up in the beauty of something and then I forget to take the photos. So that is just a little bit of troubleshooting there. Now it's really interesting doing this work because you don't have to be limited to freezing water. You can freeze wine, for example. You can freeze brewed coffee. That's a really interesting one because you can see a big difference between instant coffee compared to really great coffee, and the structures are really different. It's very similar to the differences between tap water and spring water, although coffee tends to take on more of a look of the egg albumin that I freeze sometimes. So it's a really fun one to do, and you can try all different kinds of things. Some people that are interested in bodily fluids, they like to do this technique with their urine, and it's actually a wonderful way to see what's going on inside of you. You might see patterns that resemble some hydroglyphs. You might see patterns that resemble beautiful, healthy spring water. I remember talking to somebody that sent me some amazing pictures of frozen urine, and I thought I would never say anything like this in my life if you'd asked me, like, I don't know, 15 years ago, but I said, oh my God, that's the best looking urine I've ever seen in my life. And you get, it just had so many incredible hexagons in the urine. And I've tracked my cycle using this process with urine, and I've seen specific patterns that appear in the early part of my cycle, specific patterns during the fertile stage, and specific patterns just before I get my period. So it's actually a really interesting thing to do. You can even spit into the Petri dishes and you can see some interesting things going on in there. It's usually there's some crystallography or some patterns will form on the bubbles of the saliva, and that can be very telling, really interesting. I'm just wondering how I've got 30 seconds left here. And so once I was talking to somebody about the number 8, and number 8 was the last word I spoke. And when I spat into the Petri dish and I photographed the saliva afterwards, there was like a number 8. It was almost like it was stamped in the middle of the bubble, which is really suggesting that even our saliva, it's picking up the last word we spoke. Well, there goes my timer. So I'll just go and get my camera ready straight away and pull it out. So this is wonderful because this gives you a little bit of an indication of also what my signature pattern of my water looks like. So hopefully you can see that there is liquid and you can see the crystallography there. Now I'm going to pour the liquid into my Petri dish here, and I've already wiped the bottom, and I'll give it a little wipe again. Now what you should be able to see here is the crystallography of that fanning pattern. That's the beautiful crystallography of my tank water from all the rain we've got in New Zealand. Now I'm going to take a photo. So you take a backed out photo. You don't want it to be too much in the light. Now what we want to do is take some more closed in photos. Now it's warm in here, so my ice is melting quickly. Now it's really as simple as that. So I'm going to show you the backed out photo and then these zoomed in photos here. So that's it. That's as simple as it is. Now it's just about identifying the liquid on top and the ice underneath. And again, if you are doing this and your freezer is a little bit old, or it's just on a low, not on the lowest setting, then it could take between 5 minutes all the way up to even 12 minutes for some people. When you do open the freezer door, what happens is that the more you go in there to check on the sample, it can make it take a little bit longer, but you just factor that into the timing. When you do find that it's frozen at the right stage, you can kind of go, oh, well, I opened the freezer, so maybe take off a minute. So you can play with it. Even my sample here, it probably could have used potentially another 10 to 15 seconds. So the water is actually liquid for a long time, and it kind of does this thing where all of a sudden it rips into action and it will freeze within about 30 seconds. So a really fun thing that can happen sometimes if you open the freezer and you can actually see it doing it. And you can see how fast it's moving in the freezer and how fast it's freezing. It's absolutely fascinating. Now, as far as anything else, any other tips go, I think that it's important to talk about relationship. So I have formed a relationship over these years with water where I can basically think about something I want to do, and I really feel like water already knows what I'm asking it. So I'm at this kind of stage now where I can think of something and I don't really even need to say, for example, say we're going to use the spoon as an influence, and say I might put the water over the spoon, for example, and I might do that for 30 seconds. And I have used that 30-second number for a long time because it's not too long, it's not too short, it always feels about right. But now I feel like I don't really need to even do that protocol because I feel like my relationship has become almost psychic with water. And I'm very interested also in what water has to share with me. I have seen thousands of pictures of water showing me what is in its immediate vicinity or what I'm showing it. But I've also seen water do exactly not what I'm expecting. And I think that that's one of the really fun things, is that the moment we expect water to do something, it will show us that it can do its own thing. So it is very spontaneous sometimes, and it will teach us things about ourselves. So often what we're seeing in the ice is a reflection of what's going on inside of us. I had someone once tell me that they were asking the water to show it some tulips. They were using an influence of a tulip flower. But all that week, this lady had been worried about her dogs. One of her dogs had passed away, and the other dog was in the world but was sick. And so she was super worried about her dogs. And they were very specific looking. One was an Afghan dog, and one was a whippet. And they had these kind of long noses. And so as she was doing the work, thinking that she might see a tulip, she was so shocked because what she saw were two dogs in the ice, and you can see these amazing long noses, you can see their shapes, and one dog was kind of on top of the other one, and it was really showing that this kind of one was in spirit and one was here. And it was so significant to her because all week she'd been just worried about her dog and thinking about her other dog. And she said to me, well, why didn't water show me a tulip? And I said, because water doesn't do small talk. Water isn't just interested in in proving to you that it can store information. It wants you to know that you are seen, that what matters to you is being observed and seen. And water I have found to be extremely compassionate. And one of the wonderful things that I've also observed is that water is never in judgment. Water is more of an observer. And so it also is resonating at a high frequency. So if you are feeling frustrated or angry, water isn't judging you, but water won't resonate or do any of this work with you in that kind of mindset. You don't have to be in your Zen space. You don't have to have like a perfect, like clean house with incense and like candles going or any of these kinds of things. You don't need all that. What you need is a genuine relationship. You need to set a foundation of intention. Intention is so important, which I get into a lot in my more advanced work. Intention really is so powerful that the water it's like a direct connection with water. So we can have all these different thoughts come up in our head and we can be worried, oh my God, what if I'm thinking about this? And water picks up on that. And set your intention. Don't worry so much. Have fun with this. Just stay curious. And water will find a way to communicate with you. Like I have said, I really recommend you learn about hydroglyphs, because if you're not seeing imagery the way you kind of see me getting it, then it might very, very well be that water is communicating with you in this other way. And so don't feel disheartened. I have found that water is incredibly compassionate, but it is also very much a spiritual teacher for me. And in the times where I've needed to let go of some of my control stuff, water forces me to do that, because I realize that water is wild and she doesn't want to be controlled, nor do any of us. So there are so many similarities between the water outside of us and the water within us. So I will leave it there. Hopefully you feel confident that going forward, you know how to do this technique. If you ever see repeated patterns in your ice and they are different than any I've seen in my hydroglyphs, or you just find them really interesting, please email me. I would love to hear about that. And you can contact me through the contacts page on my website. So showering you all in lots of love. See you later. Bye.